heavenly King, comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls. Amen. So we're on what?
Yeah, I can't get this to go on. It's wanting to upload. Why is it doing that?
Where were we?
Step 8 on freedom from anger and on meekness.
Okay. All right. Well, you want to read it?
Let's get started. Step 8 on freedom from anger and on meekness. As the gradual pouring of water on a fire completely extinguishes the flame, so the tears of true mourning are able to quench every flame of anger and irritability. Therefore, we place this next in order. Freedom from anger is an insatiable appetite for dishonor. Just as in the vainglorious there is an unabounded desire for praise. Freedom from anger is victory over nature and insensibility to insults, acquired by struggles and sweat. Meekness is an immovable state of soul which remains unaffected, whether in evil report or in good report, in dishonor or in praise. The beginning of freedom from anger is silence of the lips when the heart is agitated. The middle is silence of the thoughts when there is a mere disturbance of soul. And in the end is an imperturbable calm under the breath of many unclean winds. Wrath is a reminder of hidden hatred, that is to say, remembrance of wrongs. Wrath is a desire for the injury of the one who has provoked you. Irascibility is the untimely blazing up of the heart. Bitterness is a movement of displeasure seated in the soul. Anger is an easily changeable movement of one's disposition and disfiguration of soul.
If I can add, this is also the very definition of resentment.
As with the appearance of light, darkness retreats, so at the fragrance of humility all anger and bitterness vanishes. Some who are prone to anger are neglectful of the healing and cure of this passion, but these unhappy people do not give a thought to him who said, "The movement of his anger is his fall." There is a quick movement of a millstone which, in one movement, grinds and does away with the more spiritual grain and fruit than another crushes in the whole day. So we must pay attention with understanding. It is possible to have such a blaze of flame, suddenly fanned by a strong wind, as will ruin the field of the heart more than a lingering flame. And we ought not to forget, my friends, that the wicked demons sometimes suddenly leave us, so that we may neglect our strong passions as of little importance, and then become incurably sick. As a hard stone with sharp corners has all its sharpness and hard formation dulled by knocking and rubbing against other stones, and is made round, so in the same way a sharp and curt soul, by living in community and mixing with hard, hot-tempered men, undergoes one of two things. Either it cures its wound by its patience, or by retiring it will certainly discover its weakness, its cowardly flight making this clear to it as in a mirror. An angry person is a willing epileptic, who, due to an involuntary tendency, keeps convulsing and falling down. Nothing is so inappropriate to those repenting as a spirit agitated by anger, because conversion requires great humility, and anger is a sign of every kind of presumption. If it is a mark of extreme meekness, even in the presence of one's offender, to be peacefully and lovingly disposed towards him in one's heart, that it is certainly a mark of hot temper when a person continues to quarrel and rage against his offender, both by words and gestures, even when by himself. If the Holy Spirit is peace of soul, as he is said to be and he is in reality, and if anger is disturbance of heart, as it actually is and it is said to be, then nothing so prevents his presence in us as anger. Though we know many bitter fruits of anger, we have only found one, its involuntary offspring, which, though illegitimate, is nevertheless useful. I have seen people flaring up madly and vomiting their long-stored resentment, who by their very passion were delivered from passion, and who have obtained from their offender either repentance or an explanation of the long-standing grievance. I have seen others who seemed to show a brute patience, but were nourishing resentment within them under the cover of silence. And I considered them more pitiable than those given to raving, because they were sullying the whiteness of the dove with black gall. We need great care in dealing with this snake, for it too, like the snake of carnality, has nature collaborating with it. I have seen angry people push away food out of bitterness, and yet through their unreasonable abstinence they only added poison to poison. And I have seen others who, on becoming irate for some supposedly reasonable cause, but really unreasonable, gave themselves up to gluttony, and fell out of a pit headlong over a precipice. But I have seen others who were sensible, who by mixing both like good physicians, have gained from moderate consolation very great profit. Sometimes singing in moderation successfully relieves temper, but sometimes, if untimely and immoderate, it lends itself to the lure of pleasure. Let us then appoint definite times for this, and so make good use of it. When, for some reason, I was sitting outside a monastery near the cells of those living in stillness, I heard them fighting by themselves in their cells like caged partridges from bitterness and anger, and leaping at the face of their offender as if he were actually present. And I devoutly advised them not to stay in solitude, lest they should be changed from human beings into demons. And I have also observed that people whose hearts are sensual and gluttonous and are apparently meek, and, as it were, fawners, affectionate towards the brethren, and lovers of beautiful faces. And I advised these to go and adopt the life of stillness, using this as a... But when some of them told me that they were the wretched victims of these two passions, anger and sensuality, I absolutely forbade them to live according to their own will, but in a friendly way I suggested to their superiors that they should allow them sometimes to live in one way, sometimes in the other way of life, but that they should be entirely subject to the superior. The sensual person is liable to harm himself, and perhaps one other intimate friend of his as well, but the angry person, like a wolf, often disturbs the whole flock and wounds many humble souls. It is bad to disturb the eye of the heart by anger, according to him who said, "Through wrath is mine eye become troubled." But it is still worse to show in words the turmoil of the soul, and to come to blows is utterly inimical and alien to the monastic, angelic, and divine life. If you want to rather intend to take a splinter out of another person, then do not hack at it with a stick instead of a lancet, for you will only drive it in deeper. And this is a stick, rude speech and rough gestures. And this is a lancet, tempered instruction and patient reprimand. Reprove, says the apostle, rebuke, exhort, but he did not say beat. And if even this is required, do it rarely, and not with your own hand. If we are observant, we shall see that many irritable people are practicing vigils, fasts, and stillness. For the aim of the demons is to suggest to them, under the pretext of repentance and mourning, just what is likely to increase their passion. If, as we said above, a single wolf with the help of a demon can trouble a flock, then certainly one most wise brother with the help of an angel can make the waves abate and the ship sail calmly, by pouring, as it were, a good skinful of oil on the waters. and the condemnation of the former is indeed heavy, and equally great is the reward that the latter will receive from God, and he will become an edifying example for all. The beginning of blessed patience is to accept dishonor with sorrow and bitterness of soul. The middle stage is to be free from pain in the midst of these things, but perfection, if it is possible, is to regard dishonor as praise. Let the first rejoice, let the second be strong. Blessed is the third, for he exults in the Lord. I have noticed what a sorry sight angry people present by their self-esteem, though they themselves were unaware of it, for they get into a state of anger, and then they become still more angry at their defeat. And I was astonished to see how one fall was punished by another, and I pitied them as I saw them avenging sin by sin. I was horrified at the demon's trickery, and I nearly despaired of my own life. If anyone has noticed that he is easily overcome by conceit and sharp temper, guile and hypocrisy, and has the thought of defending himself against them by drawing the two-edged sword of meekness and patience, then if he wishes to be completely freed from these vices, he should go and live in a monastic community as in a fuller's shop of salvation. He should especially choose the most austere. Then he will be spiritually stretched and beaten by the insults and dishonors of his tempestuous brethren, and perhaps even sometimes physically thrashed, trampled on, and kicked. And so he may wash out the filth which is still in the sentient part of his soul. You should believe the popular saying that reproof is a washtub for the passions of the soul. For when people in the world overwhelm someone to his face with indignities, and then boast of this before others, they say, "I gave him a scrubbing," and this is perfectly true. Freedom from anger in novices as a result of mourning is one thing. The imperturbability that is found in the perfect is another. In the former, anger is held in by tears as by a bridle, but in the latter, it has been mortified by dispassion as a snake is killed by a sword. I once saw 3 monks receive the same injury at the same time. One felt the sting of this and was troubled, but kept silent. The second rejoiced at his injury for the reward it would bring him, but was sorry for the wrongdoer. And the third, thinking of the harm his erring neighbor was suffering, wept fervently. And fear, reward, and love were to be seen at work. As bodily fever is one thing, but the causes of this are not one but many, so also the boiling up of anger and the movement of our other passions have many and various causes. That is why it is impossible to prescribe one identical rule for them. Instead, I would rather suggest that each of those who are sick should most carefully seek out his own particular cure. The first step in the cure should be a diagnosis of the cause of each disease. For when this is discovered, the patients will get the right cure from God's care and from their spiritual physicians. And so, for instance, those who wish to join us in the Lord should enter the spiritual tribunal that lies before us, and there they should test themselves somewhat concerning the above-mentioned passions or their causes. So let the tyrant anger be bound with the chains of meekness, and be beaten by patience, and dragged out by holy love, and being arraigned before this court of reason, let it be duly examined. Tell us, base idiot, what is the name of the father who begot you, and the mother who brought you for evil into the world, and the names of your foul sons and daughters? And not only that, but tell us the designations of those who wage war against you and kill you. And anger might be thought to reply, "Many are my origins, and I have more than one father. My mothers are vainglory, love of money, greed, and sometimes lust. My father is called conceit. My daughters are remembrance of wrongs, enmity, self-justification, and hatred. But my opponents, who are now holding me captive, are the opposite virtues of freedom from anger and meekness. She who schemes against me is called humility. But as to who bore humility, ask her in due time herself. For the eighth step is appointed the crown of freedom from anger. He who wears it by nature will perhaps wear no other crown. but he who has won it by sweat has conquered all 8 together.
So, any questions or comments?
Hi.
Yeah.
So there's an aspect where you're saying about like silence of the lips when the heart is agitated.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
In other words, if you're disturbed about something but you don't say anything, you just keep quiet. How you doing?
Hi, I'm alright. How are you doing?
Yeah. What else?
This is something I've been noticing throughout the book, but it comes up again. It's how different his view of life is from the modern view, and in particular I'm focusing in on the word in 24. He talks about self-esteem, and he's used self-esteem maybe 10 or 12 times so far in the book, and every time it sort of carries a pejorative sense to some degree, and then at the same time he often talks about the benefit of being insulted. So it's very counter culture, and it made sort of a big impact on me. In some sense I was thinking back to like times like in my life that maybe I felt wronged, and you do your best to get over it and to try and forgive the person, but now I wonder if it's almost something to be thankful for, because according to what he's saying, it's an opportunity to maybe deal with pride. So that was a big comment, but I'm wondering if you have a comment on that. Is this, a few times you've said that maybe this is hard to achieve in the modern age and that people aren't ready for it, but this completely different idea of self-esteem is this, and this acceptance of almost what we call a verging on abuse, is that something for the modern age store? Take of it? One
thing about it, self-esteem is a very kind of unfortunate translation of the word kenodoxia in the text. And the word kenodoxia means vainglory. It doesn't mean self-esteem. Self-esteem has other connotations, and especially in America, because we have all of this literature about the importance of self-esteem and things. And so that's important to know, that this is really, the word is vainglory. However, the intuition is correct in that this is like totally counterculture, is that we want people to respect us and to feed our egos in reality. But instead, what he's saying, it's important and valuable when we're insulted, when we're degraded, when we're put down, when we're shamed, when we're cussed out, when we're, and that we can use that. Now, one of the problems with that is that, remember, this is Byzantine culture. St. John obviously was a very highly educated person, which meant he came from the upper levels of the aristocracy, which means that, and he was probably, and only the upper levels of the aristocracy could read such a book. And what was the problem with the upper levels of the aristocracy? Pride and vainglory, because they were nurtured on that. It was a society where 60% of the population were slaves, where being part of the aristocracy, they were trained to keep their slaves in line and to beat and to humiliate their slaves and treat them however they felt like, literally however they felt like. But to these people, who actually became the Holy Fathers, they were raised. They were fat little rich Greek kids. Okay, there's not much difference between then and now. You know, they're just, you know, it usually makes for men who are worthless. You know, and you see that in Mediterranean culture. It's still there. You know, they expect to be served. They expect, you know, and so their arrogance is and pride and vainglory is something that needs to be shot down at every point if they're going to be able to make the least kind of progress in monastic life. In our culture, for the most part, we don't have that. I mean, yes, we do have an aristocracy, so-called, or so they think. You know, they have lots of money anyway, and they're just as arrogant as the Byzantines were. But for the most part, but we have virtually universal literacy. So people of all different kinds of social classes, and not just the upper levels of the aristocracy, can read a book like this. And in our culture, especially among the younger people, what the primary passion is not pride and vainglory, it's self-hatred and self-pity. And so if you have somebody who's so arrogant that you can say anything and it won't even touch his arrogance, that's one thing. But if you know, for some people, if they live in this pride and in this negative pride, in this self-hatred and self-pity, you insult them and it'll send them into a tailspin, into depression. And so we're dealing with a totally different culture, and quite frankly, what we have now culturally has never existed before. You know, egalitarianism on one hand, along with literacy, along with, you know, and then, you know, all this mixing of cultural levels. So in a monastery, you can have people from, you know, who grew up very wealthy, and people who grew up at the bottom levels of society in one brotherhood, you know, absolutely equal. But, you know, for one, they need to have their ego torn down. The other one, they need to be buoyed up. It makes it far more complex. And in dealing with anger, and it's you know, and certainly, as he talks about, you know, anger can be linked. It can be linked very much with conceit, with pride, with, you know, and conceit, self-opinion, all of these things, which is vainglory, which is self-esteem in this sense. But then there's the anger of being ground down too, and the resentment for being ground down. You know, just constantly insulted, and that. The fathers don't deal with.
Ever?
Nope. Not that I've found anyway.
So then how does one overcome that?
Do we figure it out?
Just don't get ground down?
Well, yeah, it's...
Aren't we supposed to get ground down?
Well, we are, but you know, for some people who are, but if somebody has, you know, lives in self-hatred and self-pity, it doesn't take much. Where if somebody is so arrogant and conceited that no matter what you say to them, it doesn't touch it. It doesn't even dawn on them that, you know, maybe they should think about somebody else for a change. You know.
So, is it is part of what? I mean, this is when St. John was writing this. What you're telling us is that his monks and all the people he was writing to were pretty consistent.
Well, they were probably well educated, which meant they came from upper levels of society. Yeah, you know, and they, you know, they would have people, they would have slaves in the monastery. You know. But they didn't get this kind of treatment. And they got treatment of being insulted and, you know, but that's how slaves were treated in that world. In the Western Church, it was actually even institutionalized. You had the monks, and then you had the lay brothers. And the lay brothers weren't slaves per se, but they did all the manual labor. They weren't monks, and they certainly weren't priests. And in the Western monasteries, most of the monks were priests.
And
but they're just to do manual labor.
In the Russian monasteries, they had their own serfs.
They had serfs. It's a different culture. Totally different culture. And
it's really important that what you said about this time. Right. This time that which seems like, well, of course this is how things are, because this is how things are, but
right.
Very different.
It's very different. And you know, and dealing with people is you can't give everybody the spiritual literature either. Because some people drive into despair.
I was just wondering, like the second part of my sort of question or comment is, if you've experienced like being beaten down a little bit in the past, and is this a way of going back partly and seeing another side of that, seeing a benefit of it in a way? Well, almost like revisiting it and seeing that there's a potential benefit from that.
And yes, and you can use it for that, especially if you're somebody who has a big ego, and you've had to suffer, whether it was on account of your own actions or not, and gotten beaten down. Then you can look at it and say, "Oh, this was very helpful in, in cutting down the ego." So,
I have trouble accepting the idea that self-hatred is more common than pride. Maybe I think self-pity can come from a similar root, where it still is basically just focusing on the self rather than expecting from yourself love for everyone. You're expecting love from everyone, and so you just kind of, but except for in this case, rather than being praised by people, it's an unrequited sort of expectation, almost like you know, a lot of the older generation will say that my generation has a lot of issues as far as expecting the world to cater to them, sort of like what you're talking about, except for this is like any part of our cultures. It's like people expect things to be handed to them on a platter. It's usually a saying.
Well, that's just delusion.
Well,
basically.
I understand, but I mean, I just, the way that I hear people in my generation talk about just the way that they go about their interactions with others, especially with the opposite sex, they'll just basically they take pride in their sins. And I don't know if that's self-hatred or if that's just downright arrogance. And I think that, I mean, I'm not going to be the one to knock them down from that, but I think that that's very common. And self-hatred happens more in the more sentient or self-aware or, I guess, artsy types. I meet a lot of artsy types who hate themselves. But I'm struggling to see how this isn't. I think that this is very useful for me. I've always felt like I've had a huge ego, and even if I pity myself all the time, it's just because I'm looking at things wrong.
Well, I mean, it is incredibly useful, but it's not all universally applicable. It has to be applied with discernment. Yeah.
Several questions. With the wrath, like, and he's saying like there's hidden hatred and remembrance of wrongs. Is it just patience, or is it there needs to be every time the remembered wrong comes back up? Is there a need to like forgive or try to forget what?
That's the best way. Yeah, it's dealing with resentment, in other words. And so the only way to heal it is to go through and forgive the person that insulted or harmed you in the past. And so that remembering the wrong actually results in, you can actually use that remembrance of the wrong to forgive that person. But then you have to let the anger go. If you've forgiven them, you're letting it go. But you can't go back to it. You're forgiven, that's it. And you no longer judge the person. Because what happens when we judge somebody, or when somebody hurts us, we objectify them, and in objectifying them, it's like we take a snapshot of them in time, and it kind of remains frozen, and then we judge that person. Oh, that person's an angry person. That person's dangerous. That person is hurtful. That person is mean and nasty and rude and
we color them at our own will.
Yeah, and untrustworthy and evil and on and on and on and on and on, right? And we do that, and so we've got this objectification of this person, which may or may not actually have anything to do with that person themselves. Okay, they may have said something or done something just kind of accidentally or out of the blue, or we took it somehow, we took it wrong, but we still are dealing with that objectification of that person. And so in order to forgive them, what we have to do is we have to overlook that and get rid of that objectification and look and see that there's the real person there who's struggling just like we are. And that doesn't mean to justify their reaction against us, or their action against us, but it means to understand that that person is also struggling and is no different than I am. And therefore, you can pray for them, you can love them. You don't have to hold them out as some kind of dangerous thing to be avoided.
And the other thing was accepting dishonor. Doesn't matter who we accept dishonor from. Like, you know, if somebody's like we think is malicious towards us, we're dishonoring it. Do we just accept that, or is there an aspect of discerning, like, whose dishonor are we taking and accepting as okay? Just like everybody's dishonor is okay, fine, that's good.
Well, in the monastery, if you have somebody who's superior to you, and they're insulting you and saying that you're an idiot and you don't know how to do anything, and you know, and look at that row, the row that you just hoed, you know, it looks like that instead of like that. and why did you do that? And on and on and on and on, you know, and they kind of grind you down into the soil. Maybe they're doing their job in the first place, and maybe you need to pay attention to what you're doing, you know. And so in that kind of context, you can take it. But it's another thing if it feels like a personal betrayal or other, and so it's harder to understand, you know, or if somebody just out of the blue just lets loose on you for some reason. We can use them all. It's easier to use some than others. So.
When we say remembrance of wrongs, is it always remembering the wrongs that have been done to us? Because I've seen it reference times where it's remembering the wrongs that we've done to others. Would that be unusual?
It can be both.
It can be both.
Because if somebody's done wrong to us, then we in turn have probably done wrong to them as well. Because we've reacted to what they did to us. And then if we did something to them, maybe they reacted to what we did to them.
I've always been much, when it's new to me to think of remembrance of wrongs as things done to me.
Yeah.
I'm much more, my initial thought whenever I use or hear that phrase is to be troubled about the wrongs that I've done.
That's what going to preparing for confession is about, remembering the wrongs that you've done. But for the most part, it's used in wrongs done to us.
I think the context that I had heard about that originally was with respect to confession, that it was a problem to remember wrongs that I've committed because they've been confessed. Those are, I mean, you want to learn from them, but that's the problem of remembrance of wrongs, is that you're carrying around these things that have been confessed or pre-baptism.
But sometimes there's unresolved stuff that comes up, both that you've done or that somebody's done to you, and that needs to be dealt with.
Currently.
Yeah.
On number 27, it talks about the three monks, the third one who wept over his neighbor who was suffering. I'm wondering, in the modern context, I think that, I mean, I don't know what it was like back then, but I know during the Roman Empire it was pretty bad, around the end where the culture was so depraved. And now, when I hear of the things that people do, I feel very grieved and sometimes I can't tell if it's out of self-pity for living in the times that I do, and wishing that the world were more according to God's plan just for the sake of my own comfort within it, or if it's because I want to help these people find God and and have more fulfilling lives. And maybe there's a mixing of both, but where I feel like in the modern context it seems impossible to maintain that sort of love, because you'll go insane with sorrow over everything around you, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, because it's...
Well, the previous chapter was on mourning, and that would be...
But would one just go around weeping all the time?
There are those that have. Especially if you're mourning over the soul, or for people who are, committing these things and aren't even aware of it, and the damage they're doing to themselves. In other words, out of compassion.
So how do you keep that from being mixed with your own selfishness, as far as wishing that the world were more perfect just for the sake of your own convenience, or for your own, so that you wouldn't have to mourn? Because part of that is where my sense of self-pity comes from. For example, like wishing I could find, I'll be honest, I've thought a lot about women, and how very few, in part my own responsibility in this, because I've made my own falls, but how few people are even virgins in the modern day, and thinking about how that affects our culture so deeply that it's hard to find people who are even willing to have children anymore. Thinking about that makes me feel both sorrow for myself, because I'm selfish and I want these things because it'll give me a sense of fulfillment, and then it also makes me feel sorrow for other people, because how many other people are engaging in this self-destructive behavior, how many people are going to die with 12 cats and no wife or husband, and so are both of those... I feel like the first one is bad, but I don't know how to separate the two, because the first one is basically feeling sorry for myself for living in the modern age, and the second one is feeling sorry for everyone else.
Well, I think if you focus more on feeling sorry for everyone else, you'll do better. And if all you're doing is feeling sorry for yourself, you just recognize that as this basically selfishness. And because what you need to do is you need to give thanks to God for your life, and that He's allowed you to live, and He's put you where He's put you for you to work out your salvation here and now. Self-pity is not something that's looked on kindly.
Oh, I know, it's just hard not to mix the two, because I'm one of those people that, when I think of the society as a large, I consider myself part of it. So, I guess, do I consider myself separate?
No, I mean, you can... if you... Well, it's better to have compassion on others, than to feel sorry for yourself. And having compassion and feeling sorry for are two different things. Especially feeling sorry for yourself. Because feeling sorry for yourself especially implies that you believe that you deserve something else instead of accepting what God gave you.
Because I'm being offended.
Yeah. But if you have compassion on others for the, who are engaging in self-destructive behavior, and it's not just society; it's
what if they're
other concrete people that you know who are doing this, and that, these are, in other words, it's personal and not kind of some broad strokes of society or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should I not think of society at large in general then?
I think it's pretty hard to generalize.
That's true.
It's, as they say about the socialists, it's very hard or it's very easy to love man without human beings. And to love society. But what our call is to love people individually, uniquely, personally. Because each individual is a unique person with their own life and their own struggles. So.
And the image and likeness.
What's that?
And the image and likeness.
Yeah. The gospel doesn't really talk about society. You think about it, right?
Just refers to the world.
Refers to the world in not very flattering terms.
No.
Speaking of that, how do we understand generation when in the gospel or wherever it speaks of this generation? What's encompassed in that?
Well, that would be, this generation would be a way of referring to the people living now. This generation.
Sometimes it seems like it's beyond that.
Well, yeah. It is, but specifically, that's what it would refer to.
What it means, what it's not, what I think it means.
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes it doesn't. I can't remember because it's off point, but sometimes I look at the word and the phrase, and I know he's speaking beyond who's alive at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
So in number 4, so my question now is just the very practical means of dealing with these feelings that come up in us when someone says something and we feel like reacting. It seems like what he's saying is the first step is just to learn to keep the mouth closed,
right?
And then it's a process of becoming more spiritual with time. You master keeping your mouth closed, and then later on you master thinking, I'm not letting your thoughts be angry either. Is that
right?
From a very practical point of view, I'm just wondering what is a good strategy to avoid getting angry.
Well, yeah, I mean, first you learn not to express your anger, then you learn not to react to it mentally, and then third, you just let the temptation pass by. You don't let it in.
I'm definitely at the first stage. So I'm keeping my mouth shut.
thing.
Uh-huh.
Is there an aspect of anger associated with like self-will, like self-righteousness, like wanting to be right in a certain situation? So it's like, I want this person to be orthodox. I want them to accept orthodoxy. And it's like, I'm explaining it to you, then somebody pushes back, makes a statement that's not orthodox. Is there an aspect that anger starts to come out? Though it's not like, it's like, no, I don't want to be angry at this person. But it's like, there's an aspect that like, no, you have to accept this almost, but it's, so how is that dealt with in a way that's like, we're not dealing with out of anger anymore, but out of love?
Well, if you're trying to convert somebody out of anger, and you're just having at them, like of the invite the Jehovah's Witnesses in,
Yeah.
and just and start tearing them down, tearing them apart. That's not helpful. But I think we need to be careful of how and in what way we express ourselves to people. For example, if somebody has made you really angry, you want to, like if you have a kid and the kid has done something very bad, and I'm not talking about a 4-year-old, I'm talking about a 12-year-old or something like that, who can supposedly rationally understand, even an 18 or 20-year-old who can supposedly rationally understand. It's better to step back and not say anything and then return to it later on, rather than express yourself in anger. Or if you have a child and they need to be punished, and if you let your anger motivate how you punish that child, that's abusive. But if you step back and say, you're going to be punished later. Then after you've cooled down, then you whack them. It's a little bit different.
I get angry thinking about certain things going on, like, for instance, like the LGBT movement, and thinking about the sort of cultural subversion that has happened for political reasons or whatever else that has caused so much pain, and thinking about things like pedophilia in the world, and is that what is to be done about that sort of thing? Is that a good anger, or is that something that I should be working on as well? I don't know what to do about that.
Well, there's a kind of a righteous anger in that. On the other hand, what can you do? Except reach out to victims in love. I mean, that's the fruitful way of dealing with this issue. And not enabling their behavior, but letting them know there's a way out. First, they'll take that as hatred, at least in the contemporary context.
I think anger is one of my primary vices, because I've always wanted to sort of save the world, and feeling a sort of impotence against that Leviathan has sort of just, I don't know how to explain it. It's somewhat ineffable, but is there any advice you can?
When Christ saved the world, you can. It sounds glib, but it's true. So you gotta do what you can to, manifest His love and His presence and His salvation. But You can't. This is being real. Yeah. But doing that will do far more than being some kind of activist or something. Especially since you go try and be an anti-LGBT activist in Washington. Anyway, you'll end up.
Some people have tried that, I noticed.
What's that?
We know some people who've tried that.
Yeah.
At this table.
Yes, well. And look at what happened. So, shall we read through 9? It's only 2 pages.
The holy virtues are like Jacob's ladder, and the unholy vices are like the chains that fell from the chief apostle Peter. For the virtues, leading from one to another, bear him who chooses them up to heaven. But the vices by their nature beget and stifle one another. As we have just heard senseless anger calling remembrance of wrongs its own offspring, it is appropriate that we should now say something about this. Remembrance of wrongs is the consummation of anger, the keeper of sins, hatred of righteousness, ruin of virtues, poison of the soul, worm of the mind, shame of prayer, cessation of supplication, estrangement of love, a nail stuck in the soul, pleasureless feeling cherished in the sweetness of bitterness, continuous sin, unsleeping transgression, hourly malice. This dark and hateful passion, I mean remembrance of wrongs, is one of those that are produced but have no offspring. That is why we do not intend to say much about it. He who has put a stop to anger has also destroyed remembrance of wrongs, because childbirth continues only while the father is alive. He who has obtained love has banished revenge, but he who nurses enmities stores up for himself untimely labors. A banquet of love dispels hatred, and sincere gifts soothe the soul. But a heedless banquet is the mother of familiarity, and through the window of love, gluttony leaps in. I have seen hatred break the bond of long-standing fornication, and afterwards remembrance of wrongs in an amazing way did not allow the severed union to be renewed. Wonderful sight, a demon curing a demon. But perhaps this is the work not of demons, but of divine providence. Remembrance of wrongs is far removed from strong natural love, but fornication easily comes near it, just as a hidden louse can sometimes be seen in a dove. Have remembrance of wrongs and spitefulness against the demons, and be at constant enmity with your body. The flesh is an ungrateful and treacherous friend. The more you care for it, the more it injures you. Remembrance of wrongs is an interpreter of Scripture which explains the words of the Spirit allegorically in order to suit its own disposition. Let it be put to shame by the prayer of Jesus, which cannot be said with it. When, after much struggling, you are still unable to extract this thorn, you should apologize to your enemy, even if only in word. Then perhaps you may be ashamed of your long-standing insincerity towards him, and as your conscience stings you like fire, you may feel perfect love towards him. You will not know that you have completely freed yourself of this rot, not when you pray. You will know that you have completely freed yourself from this rot, not when you pray for the person who has offended you, nor when you exchange presents with him, nor when you invite him to your table, but only when, on hearing that he has fallen into spiritual or bodily misfortune, you suffer and weep for him as for yourself. An anchorite who remembers wrongs is an adder hidden in a hole, which carries about within itself deadly poison. The remembrance of Jesus' sufferings cures remembrance of wrongs, which is mightily shamed by his forbearance. Worms grow in a rotten tree, and malice finds a place in falsely meek and silent people. He who has cast it out has forgiveness, but he who clings to it is deprived of mercies. Some, for the sake of forgiveness, give themselves up to labors and struggles, but a man who is forgetful of wrongs excels them. If you forgive quickly, then you will be generously forgiven. The forgetting of wrongs is a sign of true repentance, but he who dwells on them and thinks that he is repenting is like a man who thinks he is running while he is really asleep. I have seen spiteful people recommend forgetfulness of wrongs to others. Yes, and being put to shame by their own words, they rid themselves of the passion. Let no one regard dark spite as a harmless passion, for it often manages to reach out even to spiritual men. This is the 9th step. Let him who has reached it henceforth boldly ask the Savior Jesus for release from his sins.
Okay. Questions? Comments?
I often think of the underground man from Dostoevsky.
Oh.
Your notes from Underground. And, when I start to feel the way that this describes, I just compare myself to him, and then it makes me feel ridiculous for feeling that way.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I had a question where they mentioned familiarity.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know where it was in context. Is it just...
Where?
Number 6.
Well, a heedless banquet, in other words, if you're feasting and not paying and have no self-awareness of your own, no self-awareness, in other words, you're not watching yourself, not watching over yourself, it easily breeds familiarity. And thus, in the name of love, of hospitality, of keeping the feast and of all of that, you let yourself be given over to gluttony, just as you give yourself over to familiarity with people, as opposed, in other words, overly casual relationship.
How does that relate with remembrance of wrongs? Does it tie in with remembrance of wrongs? Or does it link to remembrance of wrongs?
I think it's like it says a banquet of love dispels hatred, and sincere gifts fulfill the soul. In other words, this is about, having put away the remembrance of wrongs and kind of celebrating, but it leaves you wide open if you don't remain watchful over yourself.
Mm.
And so you can fall into another trap.
How do I know if I'm being too familiar with people?
If she tells you, keep your hands to yourself.
Oh, okay. It doesn't... Not quite what I meant, but...
Obviously, it applies in the world as it does in the monastery. In the monastery, especially it tends to be a little more, especially in Greek monasteries, the tendency is to be a little more formal. The relationships tend to be formal between people, as opposed to casual. And sometimes they can get a little too. One of the big dangers in a monastic community is to build particular relationships, particular friendships. And so if you build a particular friendship with somebody, it becomes an exclusive kind of clique kind of thing, and that's not good. And it creates opportunity for envy, opportunity for jealousy, all that kind of nonsense. And so generally in the monastery, the idea is to keep you don't let your relationships with others become this kind of become too familiar, too casual.
So how does this apply in the world?
Well, what I just said is part of it. How do you so for example, in an office or something like that, or at work, obviously there'll be some people you'll have more in common with than others and be able to talk to better than others, and you build a friendship. Well, that's all right, but there are still limits to that friendship. There's still limits to how you interrelate between the two of you.
Okay.
In other words, people have boundaries. So, for example, if the person you can talk to on the job is a liberal Democrat, but you want to preserve the friendship, you don't violate his boundaries and he doesn't violate your boundaries.
Gotcha.
In number 10 it talks about the prayer of Jesus. This was written, I was looking for when St. John was alive, but about the 600s he died, I think. So is the prayer of Jesus, or the Jesus prayer, being said in its current form since about when?
Yeah, well before this.
Okay.
So when we don't know. But it could be 2 years, 200 to 300. I don't know.
That's a long time.
Certainly, probably by the 4th century. It was probably.
one other thing really good.
What's that?
One other thing was, like when they're talking about in step 8 about anger and about like the angry person will fast, excessively, and then in their irritation they'll be gluttonous. Then here in remembrance of wrongs, we're talking about the more we care about the body, the more it injures us. Is that like an aspect of watchfulness of caring for the body? Like we hold it in check as opposed to doing something extreme?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it... So you can explain more about that and how that plays a role in either remembrance of wrong or anger.
Well, I'm not sure exactly. Are you referring to a particular text in this?
Yeah, I think it was mentioned somewhere in remembrance of wrongs.
Yeah.
I think number 9.
Yeah. Okay, number 9 is, have remembrance of wrongs and spitefulness against the demons. In other words, it's not about anybody, another person. It's about the demons. And be at constant enmity with your body. In other words, be always watchful. The flesh is an ungrateful and treacherous friend. The more you care for it, the more it injures you. In other words, the more you pamper it, the more you're ultimately you're going to be drawn into obsession with it and gratification of its desires. You want to do the 2 pages of 10?
Sure. No sensible person, I think, will dispute that slander is born of hatred and remembrance of wrongs. Therefore it comes next in order after its forebears. Slander is an offspring of hatred, a subtle yet coarse disease, a leech lurking unfelt, wasting and draining the blood of love. It is simulation of love, the patron of a heavy and unclean heart, the ruin of chastity. Some young women do wrong without shame, and there are others who secretly and with apparent great modesty behave still worse than the former, and it is the same with the passions of dishonor. There are many insincere maidens, such as hypocrisy, vice, melancholy, the remembrance of injuries, disparagement of others in one's own heart. They appear to propose one thing, but they have something else in view. I have heard people slandering, and I have rebuked them. And these doers of evil replied in self-defense that they were doing so out of love and care for the person whom they were slandering. And I said to them, stop that kind of love, otherwise you will be condemning as a liar him who said, him that privily talked against his neighbor did I drive away. If you say you have love, then pray secretly, and do not mock the man. But for this is the kind of love that is acceptable to the Lord. But I will not hide this from you, and of course, be careful lest you judge the offender. Judas was in the company of Christ's disciples, and the thief was in the company of murderers. Yet it is a wondrous thing how in a single instance they exchanged places. He who wants to overcome the spirit of slander should not ascribe the blame to the person who falls, but to the demon who suggests it. For no one really wants to sin against God, even though we all sin without being forced to do so. I have known a man who sinned openly and repented secretly. I condemned him as a profligate, but he was chaste before God, having propitiated him by a genuine conversion. Do not regard the feelings of a person who speaks to you about his neighbor disparagingly, but rather say to him, "Stop, brother, I fall into graver sins every day, so how can I criticize him?" In this way you will achieve two things. You will heal yourself and your neighbor with one plaster. This is one of the shortest ways to the forgiveness of sins. I mean, not to judge. Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Fire and water are incompatible, and so is judging others and one who wants to repent. If you see someone falling into sin at the very moment of his death, even then do not judge him, because the divine judgment is hidden from men. Some have fallen openly into great sins, but they have done greater good deeds in secret. So their critics were tricked, getting smoke instead of the sun. Listen to me, listen, all you malicious reckoners of other men's accounts. If it is true, as it is really true, that with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, then whatever sins we blame our neighbor for, whether bodily or spiritual, we shall fall into them ourselves, that is certain. Hasty and severe judges of the sins of their neighbor fall into this passion because they have not yet attained to a thorough and constant remembrance and concern for their own sins. For if anyone could see his own vices accurately without the veil of self-love, he would worry about no one else in this life, considering that he would not have time enough for mourning for himself, even though he were to live 100 years, even though he were to see a whole river Jordan of tears streaming from his eyes. I have observed such mourning, and I do not find in it even a trace of calumny or criticism. The demons, murderers as they are, push us into sin, or if they fail to do this, they get us to pass judgment on those who are sinning, so that they may defile us with a stain which we ourselves condemning in another. This is one of the marks by which we can recognize spiteful and slanderous people. They are pitilessly plunged in the spirit of hatred, and with pleasure and without a qualm they slander the teaching or affairs or achievements of their neighbor. I have seen some committing the gravest sins in secret and without exposure, and in their supposed purity they have harshly inveighed against persons who have a petty fall in public. To judge others is a shameless arrogation of the divine prerogative. To condemn is the ruin of one's soul. Even without any other passion, self-esteem can ruin a man, and in the same way, if we have formed the habit of judging, we can be utterly ruined by this alone, for indeed the Pharisee was condemned for this very thing. A good grape picker who eats the ripe grapes will not start gathering unripe ones. A charitable and sensible mind takes careful note of whatever virtues it sees in anyone, but a fool looks for faults and defects. And of such it is said, "They have searched after iniquity, and in searching they are grown weary of searching." Do not condemn even if you see with your eyes, for they are often deceived. The 10th Ascent. He who has mastered it is one who practices love or mourning.
Well, comments, questions? How easy it is to fall into slander, and how important it is to shut it off.
So, in the one instance where he's calling out the other person's slander and saying you shouldn't slander and mentioning the psalm verse, is that like slandering slander?
No, that's a spiritual father correcting somebody.
Oh, okay. So it's not our place to, if somebody's like...
Well, not unless it's you have the responsibility to do it. Though what he recommends is, if you see somebody slandering, try and change the subject or walk away.
So I work blue collar, and a big part of the work culture is kind of ragging on each other. Where is that just blatant slander, or is that more of a brotherly?
That's usually brotherly banter.
How do you discern where you're going too far if it's
going to harm the person? I mean, it's one thing to tease somebody. It's another thing to say, to expose their sins or to cut them down and say, well, you're just a worthless piece of so and so, and mean it.
Okay.
In order to demoralize them, or to talk about somebody else. And that's the real danger in slander. Talking about somebody else who's not present.
That one's difficult to avoid.
Oh, did you hear about so and so? What an idiot he is! He can't do anything right. Did you see how he tried to fit that 1/2-inch pipe into a 3/4-inch pipe? And it flooded the whole basement.
Every day. That's the kind of thing. Yep.
Well, duct tape works, doesn't it?
To fix what? Stupid? No. They say you can't fix stupid.
Is it slander if it's true? Yeah, but if you were to go to the boss and say, this guy's really stupid. He can't do the job. Are you being responsible, or are you slandering him?
I guess it depends. I have a coworker who's recently been just spending the entire time hiding and watching Disney Plus on his phone. But then he openly tells his boss that he does this. So it's like, okay, I can't... There's nothing... What's your aim? He wants to get fired. Anyway, sorry. I don't know if that's slandering. I think that's just a story, though. He brags about it. It's funny.
I think one thing is, I don't remember where it is. This is in 9. This is really important. Listen to me, listen, all you malicious reckoners of other men's accounts. If it is true, as it really is true, that with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. Then whatever sins we blame our neighbor for, whether bodily or spiritual, we shall fall into them ourselves. That is certain. So, that's like a spiritual law.
So does that mean we just repent of the sins of others? We judge them immediately?
Well, you can pray for them. If you see them sinning, you judge them. You don't slander them.
Mm-hmm. So is there an aspect of slander is what we say, whereas judging is what we're thinking?
Yeah.
When people tell me about their, when they brag for, I'll just say what I'm trying to say. I have a lot of coworkers who tell me about very explicit acts that they've done, and they brag about it. But when they tell me, I almost feel guilty. I feel guilty of their sins. Mm-hmm. Is that, what is that? Is there an explanation for that, or is that something that Am I projecting? What am I doing here?
Well,
why do I feel that way?
well, I think you realize the gravity of it that they don't realize, and that's a kind of compassion. Maybe.
Yeah.
I think. So, well, shall we wrap it up here? Okay. All right. So we'll pick up after Theophany. But on the 14th of January, would y'all like to meet and go out and have dinner?
Yeah.
Or have dinner at my house? We could do that. Which would you prefer?
I eat at your house almost once a week.
Yeah, you do?
So,
If it's a fast-free day, go to
It's fast free.
Yeah, there's different restaurants that it's like endless supply of meat that you could go do.
okay, I'm allergic to red meat.
Oh, well, you could order endless supply of chicken too. It's a thought.
It's not as appealing to me as with other people.
Okay.
We can talk about this off camera though.
That's
It's
what-
like-
That's right.
it doesn't
Yeah,
make
it
it
probably
easy.
should not be recorded.
So anyway,
What the decision is.
On the 14th, you want to go?
Yeah.
We'll get together.
Or we
And
could
have
then
dinner.
go to you too, Bloody.
Yeah, we could do that.
Yeah. You had the idea of a potluck earlier. And
Yeah,
that
but-
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at the house rather than here, probably.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's do that. All right, let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption, that gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love from mankind, always now to the ages of ages.
Amen.
Peaceful life is
God bless you.